Okay, great. Let's hit the present. All right. Okay. So this is the second thing of notes that we have for the chapter. It's mainly moving on to section 2. So on Friday, we were introducing the chapter, talking about mainly, and when I say we, it's mainly me talking and you trying to stay awake, but I want to include you in the experience. So we were talking about the differences between prehistory, which this chapter covers, and history. And we determined that the main difference is that history relies a lot on written evidence, right? And prehistory, those who study prehistory, archaeologists, anthropologists, stuff like that, have to fill in the blanks with things like fossils and artifacts, And so in the story of the Iceman, which we had talked about last week, the fossil example would be obviously be himself, right? And, artifacts would be his rucksack, his fur robe, things of that nature, right? However, he didn't leave behind a journal. So while they've determined based on what it looks like a arrow indentation in his back that he was killed, murdered, if you will, we don't know by whom or why, because he didn't leave behind written records. So there's every few years, like I said, they kind of bring out Ötzi, the Iceman, and they try to kind of test these theories and hypotheses and such. Like they tested the idea that the one theory was that he was probably a shepherd, but after testing the theory, kind of recreating the kind of clothing that he had and the shoes that he wore, that he probably wasn't a shepherd, that wouldn't have been, his footwear wasn't conducive to kind of climbing high altitudes with sheep and such like that. So they determined he was probably ostracized out of a small group. But again, they don't know for sure, right? And so in many cases with this chapter, there's always kind of theories and hypotheses that are always being challenged, and sometimes the results lead into a whole different conclusion, if you will. All right. And so what this section is doing is kind of using prehistory to basically trace our origins from essentially where we originated from, how we moved from essentially kind of solitary kind of species to ones that are more social, developing cultures, and then which leads into chapter 2, the evidence of civilizations. What this section is primarily dealing with is the study of evolution, human evolution. Right. And so you guys probably had discussed this in biology classes. The idea that with evolution is a theory that we modern humans developed from what we call earlier hominids. I'll explain what a hominid is. But those who study human evolution are often referred to as paleoanthropologists or engaging in paleoanthropology, kind of filling in the blanks, if you will. All right. As you guys knew from your biology class, the kind of theory of evolution is credited to Charles Darwin. And Darwin wrote a book called The Origins of the Species, in which he spent a lot of time observing on the Galapagos Islands, these islands just off the coast of Ecuador in South America, various like birds and reptiles and that, and kind of noting their slight variations. And these changes, which kind of develop over time, were primarily done biologically so the species can survive, protect themselves against predators, so on and so forth. All right. Eventually, people decided to kind of translate that theory into us, all right, in trying to figure out where we had our origins, where we started. All right. So it's a theory. And again, not everybody subscribes to the theory of evolution based on religious beliefs and such. So I don't mean to try to kind of make light of that. But it's a pretty solid theory based on kind of scientific evidence and research, and that, for example, gravity is technically a theory, but we're still pretty kind of tethered to the ground for the most part. All right. But again, this is a chapter, like our textbook actually, technically, I'll explain a little bit there, is actually outdated based on new evidence that was discovered. All right. So when we talk about evolution, a lot of times they tend to kind of focus on this kind of linear progression, that kind of man's kind of primate origins and then kind of develop into kind of walking upright and that as kind of like a straight line. In reality, it's more like a tree where you have some branches that branch from other branches, right, grow from other branches. But then you have some branches that are dead branches. Like a prime example would be in the early 2000s, paleoanthropologists discovered the remains of a classification species named Homo florus. Now, Homo florus, based on the kind of evidence and the dating that they used, existed roughly around the same time as our modern species did early on. However, they were much smaller, so they were often referred to Homo florus as Hobbit Man because it was right around the time the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out, and that could have been an example of a species that basically died out. Another one that we'll talk about this up for debate is Neanderthals, which we'll talk about on Friday. All right, is one of those kind of evolutionary branches that just essentially kind of died out, if you will. So the linear kind of progression thing is maybe a little bit too simplified, but it's the one that people tend to kind of understand the most. All right, now, like I said, the kind of study of human evolution is basically the study of hominids. What's a hominid? Is simply a creature that walks upright, particularly walks upright on two legs, right? And that ability to walk upright on two legs is referred to as bipedalism. Pedaling, think of like riding a bike, pedal, bi meaning two. All right. So we are technically hominids, right? Now, the ability to be bipedal doesn't strictly make one species human or human-like, if you will. All right. Like, for example, ostriches have the ability of bipedalism. No one is going to confuse an ostrich within the kind of the train of or the tree of evolution. There's other things that play a factor. The kind of skull cap, the size of the cranium, but a big emphasis is on kind of like the leg bone, the femur, as well as the pelvic bone to indicate bipedalism. That wasn't always the case. That's the concept of bipedalism as a kind of main factor in determining what makes kind of a hominid. For a long time, kind of took a backseat to kind of the size of the skull. But some discoveries in the kind of the 20th century kind of changed that kind of way of thinking, if you will. All right. Now, as far as hominids go, kind of where did kind of hominids originate? Most scientists who are paleoanthropologists or whatever, the popular contemporary thought is that all early hominids originated in Africa. Now, what I have here, some 3 to 4 million years ago, really actually probably is actually a million years earlier, all right, with some new discoveries here. But it's just kind of what they call the out of Africa theory, right? Mainly because all the kind of the oldest ones they've found have only been found in Africa, all right? And so the theory is at one point our human ancestors basically kind of venture out of Africa for various reasons, all right? This is early on in paleoanthropology wasn't a popular theory. Majority of paleoanthropologists were in Europe, and so a lot of them were kind of advocating for what they call the missing link, being closer to Europe, because Europe at the time was, in a kind of very arrogant way, was the quote unquote civilized world, if you will. All right, but there's a number of paleoanthropologists that made discoveries that kind of made it hard to deny that this is where our kind of species originated, right, in Africa, if you will. All right. Now, so what I'm going to do here, as far as kind of classifying hominids and kind of going from our oldest to our modern kind of human species, is I'm going to classify it through use of Roman numerals. All right. And so, according to your text, the oldest of the hominids, and this has changed when they redo this textbook, do another edition, they're going to have to kind of change this a little bit. But the oldest of the hominids, up until about 2010, was a classification called Australopithecines. All right, I'm not going to make you type that out. As you notice, it's already kind of on there. The years 3 to 4 million years ago, the brain size, I believe, was about a third of our brains, mainly from the kind of the skull cap and the kind of the cranium size, if you will. Australopithecines, as far as like kind of appearance, still appear very kind of primate-like. So not all there's some paleoanthropologists that debate whether this should be included on the classification of human species, but the majority of those who are paleoanthropologists will put this up until 2010 as the kind of the first step, if you will. All right. This is kind of some discoveries here. Like they found this one, which was basically they just found parts of a cheek, kind of parts of cheekbones, some teeth, parts of like kind of the skull. The black part obviously is kind of like a mold that they kind of recreated. So from that, just that mold there, just from those few kind of like bones that they found, they determined that the appearance, like I said, is very, very primate-like. All right. Because it's one of the earliest also hominid discoveries, all major Australopithecine finds, and then the ones that predate them, actually all have only been discovered in Africa, and primarily East and Southern Africa, stretching from Ethiopia, the Hadar region, which was in the worksheet I gave you guys yesterday, or on Monday, I should say, and down through Tanzania and Kenya in what they call the Great Rift Valley, the Olduvai Gorge, Latoli, and then down into South Africa. All right, so it's only, and this is where the kind of the theory here, the kind of out of Africa theory, really becomes entrenched, because this is only where they've only found Australopithecine discoveries in Africa. All right. And like I said, Eastern and Southern Africa. These areas tend to be, there's certain pockets there that are very, very dry, somewhat isolated. So these fossil remains remain there for a long period of time. All right. Now, the first major Australopithecine discovery, where kind of begins this kind of like this theory here, this out of Africa theory, was something discovered in 1924, referred to as the Tong Child. All right, the guy who's credited with that is a Australian who was a professor in South Africa, who was one of the early proponents that the missing link would be in Africa. All right. And so the story was that Dart was leading this expedition. Matter of fact, he wasn't there when they at the expedition where they uncovered the fossil remains. He was getting ready for a wedding. And then some of the workers came to his house with a crate. In there, he had a skull, a pretty developed, like, kind of like intact skull, with the exception of a kind of a hole there on the kind of the backside. I believe some teeth and a leg bone. All right, and that leg bone was key. The femur there kind of indicated in its elongation that this was not necessarily modern, but not necessarily primate, and that there was a little bit of elongation that allowed for it to the theory to have bipedalism. All right, now Dart publishes his findings, thinking that he's going to be kind of accepted in the kind of paleoanthropology world. But as a science, a lot of people were skeptical of this. And the problem is that the majority of paleoanthropologists thought that the missing link would be closer to Europe. And there was a discovery in the 1890s called Piltdown Man that turned out to be a hoax, that actually it was the jawbone of a chimpanzee and the leg bone of a modern human. And so after that was determined to be a hoax, Dart's theory was a little bit more accepted by the 50s, if you will. However, it's not going to be, it's really going to take 50 years for his like official kind of like concept of out of Africa theory to be really, really fully kind of accepted within the paleoanthropology world. All right. So there's Dart holding the kind of skull of the Tong Child. Again, called child because very small. You can't quite tell in the back there. There was a kind of an indentation into the skull, indicating that probably the Tong Child was attacked by a bird of prey, which also indicates that our ancestors, our human ancestors at this time, were not at the top of the evolutionary food chain. All right. Like I said, it took about 50 years for Dart's kind of theories to be fully, completely accepted. And that's with the discovery of Lucy, which you guys did the worksheet on. All right. Lucy, for a long time, was considered the oldest, most complete, and best preserved hominid. However, that's changed. It's the oldest, most complete, and best preserved Australopithecine up until this point. All right. Called Lucy because the Beatles song "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." The kind of the expedition group was a very young group led by a guy named Donald Johanson, who's a graduate of the University of Illinois. He was working for Case Western University in Cleveland, which has a pretty strong paleoanthropology department. Like the article had said, him and Tim White, one of his partners in the dig, just happened to kind of discover the remains there of Lucy. All right. And so this kind of basically solidifies Dart's kind of out of Africa theory, if you will. All right. This is essentially what, and this is a replica in the Field Museum in Chicago of Lucy. About 10 years ago, the Ethiopian government actually had a tour. They toured various museums in the United States. The Field Museum in Chicago got to hold a kind of a little exposition on Lucy there. Like I said, you see kind of like parts of a skull, rib bones. The key, though, here is the pelvic bone and the leg bone, the femur. All right, which indicates, well, it's still a little bit bowed, but it indicates bipedalism. It's a little bit straighter than a kind of a typical primate. All right. According to kind of artist rendering, this is probably what Lucy looked like. Very primate-like, right? And the theory is that Lucy spent half the time in trees and then on the ground, all right? And that the idea of bipedalism occurred as a kind of an evolutionary trait to protect against predators. So this was an area that had tall grass, being able to stand and walk on by two legs, bipedal. You could see over the grasslands for possible predators. That's the theory, if you will. All right. There's Donald Johanson. That's a fresh look for any paleoanthropologist. This is a picture that was taken in the 80s, though. He's in his, I believe he may be in his 80s himself. He's still a professor, I think, in Arizona State University. However, Lucy, as the oldest, most complete hominid, was replaced in 2010. In 1994, there was a discovery in Ethiopia, not too far, where Lucy was discovered, that basically pushes the evolutionary story back 1 million years, about 5 million years ago. All right, and a new classification called Ardipithecus. So this discovery is referred to as Ardi, and subsequently there have been other discoveries that kind of date around this area as well. All right, Ardi itself means, like in the kind of the dialect there in the local language in Ethiopia, meaning like ground floor. All right, Ardi, like Lucy, probably kind of lived in trees as well. All right, so 2010, it became official that the majority of kind of paleoanthropology world sees this as the kind of like our kind of missing link, if you will. All right. So our textbook is already outdated after it was basically sent out to schools. So the next time they kind of reprint this, they're going to have to include Ardi in here. I kind of changed a little bit of that chapter. All right. Ardi, these are the kind of the fossil remains. There's more teeth that were found, all right, canine teeth and such. But again, the emphasis here on a kind of the pelvic bone and the leg bone. All right. However, you look at the kind of hands and feet, Ardi is even more primate looking than Lucy is. The people who are skeptics, who are kind of challenging this, kind of tend to kind of focus on the feet there, which the feet seem to look very, very primate-like. And so almost like a thumb for a big toe. That probably indicates that probably Ardi and Ardi's kind of similar species probably spent more time in trees, all right, which is kind of a very primate trait there. All right. So like I said, the textbook's already outdated. Now, moving back to Australopithecines, about 4 years after Lucy was discovered, there was a discovery made in Tanzania that was kind of unique as far as kind of archaeological discovery. It wasn't fossil remains, but it was footprints. Right, and this area totally was incredibly kind of isolated and very dry. So these footprints were kind of maintained, and they believed, after kind of taking the kind of soil samples and using potassium argon dating, that they dated anywhere between 3.7 and 3.8 million years, which puts it in the time frame of Australopithecine. All right. And so this essentially kind of added and basically kind of solidified the kind of out of Africa theory, if you will. All right. And so the head of the expedition that was kind of credited to this is Mary Leakey, and we'll talk about her again here in another slide. The Leakeys are basically, particularly in the 20th century, the first family of paleoanthropology. All right. They're probably the most famous kind of paleoanthropologists other than Donald Johanson. And so this is Mary kind of measuring the footprints here. You see a very dry kind of area. Now, the footprints were pretty unique in the sense is that it's probably what we call a nuclear family, right? So they believe there's an adult male right here, an adult female, and then like any kid, like a child kind of running off kind of away from their parents. The footprints themselves are unique in the sense they're not primate, the indentation. They're not human, so they're somewhere kind of like in between there is the theory. Like I said, extracting soil from the indentation the footprint made kind of dates it back to 3.7, 3.8 million years ago. All right, so like I said, Australopithecine is kind of now replaced, though, as the kind of missing link, the oldest kind of like human species by Ardipithecus, but there's still some people that debate that. All right. Now, our second kind of classification that majority of them believe that Australopithecine evolved into is Homo habilis. All right. This is our first kind of classification of man, if you will, the word Homo. All right. The name Homo habilis means skillful man. All right. So the years anywhere between 2.5 to 2 million years ago. All right. Based on the kind of the size of the kind of skull cap, probably a 50% larger brain than Australopithecines. All right. Still pretty primate-ish, kind of primate looking. However, they used that larger brain to their advantage. And that's the thing that kind of definitely separates them from Australopithecine. All right. And so, again, like the skull of the Homo habilis here, just still heavy brow there, very kind of primate-ish. Artist rendering indicates this maybe what it looked like, but it's not necessarily the appearance that we're really concerned about. It's what Homo habilis is holding in his hand, all right? Because that ushers in an era referred to as the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. Most paleoanthropologists believe that the use of stone tools starts with Homo habilis, which hence the name skillful, but it's not the use. And these tools are very rudimentary. All right, they're basically flint stones. They basically rocks that are flaked or flinted to create some type of point. Now, they're not using these tools in the sense to like what we use tools to build things, right? They're essentially using these tools to crack open the bones of animals that have been hunted and killed and left behind. And basically we take those stone tools to crack open the bones of these animals to extract bone marrow, right, to survive, essentially. And again, like Australopithecine, Homo habilis is not at the top of the food chain. All right. So the Stone Ages, they're kind of separate the Stone Ages based on how these tools are being used, how stone tools are being used. So I'll show you a picture, kind of show you kind of an example of some of these kind of early stone tools. You're not going to be impressed. All right. They're just basically, they look like rocks. All right. Like you and I, if we kind of saw these, we would just say, oh, those are big rocks. But paleoanthropologists look at certain kind of things, such as like the kind of like the flaking here to kind of create a point, almost like sharpening, if you will. All right. But again, they're pretty rudimentary, and they're mainly used to crack open bones of animals that have already been hunted and killed. All right, to kind of extract bone marrow. And again, that's the idea with evolution. You basically try to survive. You change, you kind of come at the idea, you see what's around you, and you basically shape that to your advantage, if you will. All right. The first major Homo habilis discovery occurred in 1960. Again, you see Mary there, Mary Leakey there. But this is really where the Leakeys kind of made a name for themselves. Her and her husband, Louis Leakey, discovered what they call East African man, which is not too far from where she, 28 years later, discovered the remains of, or 17, 18 years later, the remains of the footprints of the Australopithecines there. So this, much like Lucy's discovery, East African man discovered by basically happenstance. The story was that Mary was driving into the nearest village to get gasoline there, and on her way back, one of the cans fell out, and it just happened to fall real close to what kind of caught her eye. Was basically kind of remains there, and alongside the remains, they found like stone tools. Basically, these kind of flinted stones, if you will. All right, and so up until kind of Lucy, this for a lot of paleoanthropologists was kind of considered the kind of the old, like the kind of out of Africa theory was kind of starting to kind of become more popular, right? With Lucy's discovery, then boom, that's kind of solidified. All right, and so here's the Leakeys holding the jawbone of a 2 million year old hominid, which, I mean, you guys probably have a picture of your grandparents doing something similar. All right, that's about it here. Okay, so is that all right? Are you guys okay with that? It's all right. I see some people. Look at some people are awake. Weird. All right. So tomorrow I'm going to send out a primary source article here from Richard Leakey, the Leakey's son, who's also a paleoanthropologist. And then on Friday, I want to finish up the section. We'll talk about I'll get to our modern human species. Okay. All right. And I'm going to record this. This is recorded. I'm going to put it on Google Classroom if you want to go back and look at it if you missed any notes. Sound good? All right, guys. Have a good day, and I will see you on Friday.